Stop me if you've heard this one before. The movie's hero is about to be sent back in time to correct something in the past that's causing some urgent problem in the present. But their zany scientist friend warns them they must be absolutely certain not to change anything except for the exact thing they're going back to fix. And under no circumstances can they interact with their past self. Why not? Well, of course, that would create a temporal paradox. It seems like every time a story uses time travel, we find it rapidly running up against these kind of problems. The whole thing rapidly becomes a knot of complicated interactions and causal ripples across the fabric of the narrative. And even when it doesn't cause narrative ripples, audiences are often quick to critique the logical holes created by even the most benign time travel scenario. You almost have to wonder why anyone would bother writing about this at all. Except, honestly, paradoxically, turns out the paradoxes are actually just part of the fun. It can be pretty hard to find opportunities to do really experimental stuff as a content creator. Usually that kind of thing is pretty risky and can end up costing a lot of money. Nevertheless, we have managed to do some pretty weird stuff. Like this video about a fantasy setting that basically has gigantic geographic genitalia, or this video about crafting living beings with magic. But the coolest thing we've ever done, hands down, our 6-part original series, Worldsmiths, which explores some of the most unique fiction by some of the most unique authors. Junji Ito's weirdly pleasant psychological world of horror, Neil Gaiman's darkly honest approach to writing children's stories, and a bunch of others. We put so much effort into that series, and we are just so proud of it. And the reason we got to do all of that? This stuff that would just be a bit too risky to try here on YouTube. Our streaming platform, Nebula. We literally get paid to do experiments over there. So if you want to see us try more weird and interesting stuff, visit go.nebula.tv/Talefoundry and sign up for just $2.50 a month. There are a ton of other creators experimenting over there too, so once you're done with our stuff, you'll have plenty left to explore. But definitely look at our stuff first. Again, visit go.nebula.tv/Talefoundry and go watch our original series, Worldsmiths. Now, back to the video. You all knew there was no way we were going to talk about this without bringing up Back to the Future, right? It was basically the movie that popularized time travel stories and brought them into the mainstream way back in 1985, and that's kind of funny because it's also overflowing with paradoxes. In the movie, our hero, Marty McFly, is accidentally thrown 30 years into the past, back to 1955. There, while looking desperately for a way to get back to the future, he accidentally gets between his young parents and prevents them from getting together. This is, of course, a problem because if his parents never got together, that means he would never have been born. But then, if he was never born, how did he go back in time and get between his parents? And if he was never born and never got between his parents, shouldn't his parents still have gotten together? And shouldn't he, still exist? This is probably the most common of all the temporal paradoxes. It's known as the grandfather paradox because if you were to go back in time and kill your own grandfather, you would create the same essential loop. If he doesn't exist, you don't exist. If you don't exist, that would mean you also never killed him. If you never killed him, you would still exist. But it's not really that literal either. It's not just a thing that happens with murder. This can happen in a lot of different ways. Say you go back in time through a portal, and then, while you're in the past, you prevent yourself from ever going through that portal. This too would be an example of the grandfather paradox, just sans the grandfather. Another of my favorite twists from Back to the Future happens when Marty McFly is at a school dance and he plays Chuck Berry's 1958 rock and roll hit, Johnny Be Good, which Chuck Berry himself, who is there on stage with Marty, hears for the first time and goes on to steal and pass off as his own, suggesting that that's where the song came from. But back in the future, the Chuck Berry version was the one Marty originally heard. If he learned it from Chuck Berry and Berry learned it from him, where did the song come from? This is what we call the causality or the bootstrap paradox, named after Robert Heinlein's 1941 novel By His Bootstraps, which makes extensive use of it. It's basically where something from the future is also its own source in the past, creating a complete causal loop with no actual start point. One of the underlying ideals here is that you can't change the past, because everything you do has already resulted in the future you've been experiencing. Every change you try to make somehow brings you back to where you were. In a weird way, it's the exact opposite of the grandfather paradox. Instead of something preventing itself in the past, this is something causing itself in the past, intentionally or no. But that raises an interesting question. If Johnny Be Good was a song that already existed and existed because Marty went into the past and introduced Chuck Berry to it, doesn't the fact that it existed in the future demonstrate that there was never actually any path but for Marty to go back and introduce him to it? Otherwise, how was the future ever possible? If that's the case, does Marty even have the option to cause this loop? Or is the fact that it exists already evidence that it was going to happen anyway? This is known as the paradox of free will, and basically suggests that anything you do to change the past was actually already done. Your meddling is just the natural trajectory of things, and always was. By playing Johnny Be Good at the school dance, in a way, Marty was just fulfilling his destiny. This dynamic gets pretty complicated when a character becomes aware of this fact and intentionally tries to circumvent it. If Marty had refused to play the song this time, too bad, we already know he's the song's source, so narratively, what ended up causing him to do it? Was it somehow an accident? Does he realize that he needs to for some reason? Maybe to preserve the integrity of space-time? There are a lot of interesting ways to play with this one, especially in terms of how the characters caught in the paradox react to it. So, those are the three big ones: the grandfather paradox, the bootstrap paradox, and the free will paradox. I'm sure there are other variants or subvariants out there, but these are the ones you're most likely to run across. And in Back to the Future, the tone is relaxed and fun enough that you really don't have to care. But for a more serious story, these can often be deal breakers for immersion. If we were really invested in the question of how Marty's trip back in time affected the future, it might be frustrating for the final answer to just be a nonsensical loop that you're just not supposed to think about too hard. In fact, the idea might even be so unpalatable that any of you writers watching might just be tempted to avoid time travel altogether, just so you don't get caught in the logical spaghetti mess of one of these paradoxes. And I wouldn't blame you. Fortunately, not all time travel stories have to be like this. In fact, a lot of them are so airtight that they literally can't have paradoxes. In the game Zelda Majora's Mask, the world of Termina is going to end in exactly 3 days. The moon is falling, and nothing can stop it. Nothing except for a little magic. Our hero Link is no stranger to time travel, and with his magic ocarina, he's able to learn a tune that will send him exactly 3 days into the past, to the day when he first arrived and realized the world was ending. You spend the game watching the clock tick down, resetting over and over, losing almost all your items, restarting from scratch, searching for a way to avert the coming disaster. You do, however, get to keep your memories, and any items key to the game's progression. So, day by repetitious day, as the world repeats and you become more powerful, more influential, more knowledgeable, you're finally able to do enough to stop the moon itself from crashing down. And at last, Link is free from this 3-day Doomsday Purgatory. This is our classic time loop narrative. Extremely common, but not actually a paradox. That's because it's an insulated bubble. There's no ripple effect into the future because until you choose the right path and find the solution to the problem, time simply won't progress. And despite the riddlesome nature of having to find the right way out, there's also no free will paradox here, because you're not actually predestined to choose any given path. You could just stay in the bubble forever. You could make Link live out the same 3 days for eternity, or even just let the moon come falling down. That's up to you. The self-contained nature of this trope lends itself really well to trial and error stories, and it's so uncomplicated, you actually kind of see it all over the place. Heck, you could even interpret the save system in the game as a miniature time loop, where when you fail, you're sent back to an earlier game state, over and over until you do the right thing and break out of the loop. There are also some time travel stories that avoid paradoxes by splitting time up. In the visual novel Steins Gate, possibly my favorite ever depiction of time travel, a group of friends stumble across a way to send short text messages into the past, and then how to do the same for someone's consciousness, sending it back up to 3 days in time into their past self's body. Any choice they make that differs from their original timeline will branch them off into a parallel version of reality with everyone's memories, save for the main characters, changed to match. It seems like a pretty sweet deal, until you start to confront all the horrific ramifications of meddling with time this way. Are they technically killing themselves every time they overwrite their alternate self? Are some events so powerful that they're just destined to happen on every timeline, no matter how you try to change them? There is tragedy here, and complexity, and headache galore, but no temporal paradoxes. While there are a few plot holes, they don't really involve the time travel system itself, which makes it a pretty satisfying experience overall. This type of time travel is often referred to as split timelines or alternate timelines. In these universes, every potential change in a timeline causes the timeline to branch, like a choose-your-own-adventure book with different endings. In a model like this, killing your grandfather spawns an alternate timeline in which you were never born, but the timeline where you were born, and thus can go back and kill him, still exists, if you can find your way back to it. And then, of course, there's traveling forward through time. One of the earliest time travel stories, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, is actually just this. The narrator travels into the future and sees the tragic state of humanity as it evolves into what are essentially two new species, sees the environment change as the sun gets hotter, sees the last living life forms on a desolate near-death Earth, and then, finally, returns home. Because he's traveling to the future and not the past, there really isn't an opportunity for anything he does to have a causal effect on the timeline. So, rather than paradoxes, we end up with something a little closer to prescience, where he gets to see what events are to come. The time traveler in H.G. Wells' story doesn't do anything to change the future he saw, but in theory, he could try. The result could be a little like Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, who gets to see the future which will result from his current path and choose a different one. So, time travel stories don't really have to be paradoxical messes, and if that's the case, why would any writer bother with the ones that are? Why not stay in the safe, insulated bubble of a time loop, or the rationally excusable world of parallel timelines, or the relative tidiness of future time travel? The answer won't shock you, but it needs to be said. It's because these paradoxes are interesting and fun, even with all of their logical failings. Remember earlier when I said that Link, the hero of Majora's Mask, is no stranger to time travel? That's because he does loads of it in the game's predecessor, Zelda Ocarina of Time. The game is pretty good about avoiding paradoxes for the most part, but weirdly, one of my favorite moments? When you travel into the future to learn a song from someone who says that they learned it from some kid in the past, and then you go back in time and play it for them in the past, becoming the kid that they originally learned it from. Both the free will paradox and the bootstrap paradox are at play here, and still, it is so much fun. At one point in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry saves his past self from being killed by Dementors, an event which happens earlier in the story, and during which Harry, seeing his future self in the distance, mistakes himself for his father, come to save him from beyond the grave. It's a touching, awe-inspiring moment that has always stuck with me, even though, technically, the method they used for time travel is just rife with problems. It's a bauble called a time turner, which allows characters to travel a limited distance into the past. Hermione's been using it to study, and cleverly, the characters realize they can use it to fix some of the events that happen near the story's end. But is it clever though? Really? As we've seen by Harry's use of it to save himself, anything you can use the time turner to go back and change in the past will already have resulted in your present, so they really had no choice but to do this, right? Yes, probably, but the scene is still awesome. You can get lost for decades in the terrible fridge logic of Harry Potter's time travel and the time travel of so many other stories, but if you don't have to, why would you? This story about kids learning magic and turning into animals and playing aerial death sports? The time travel brings something wonderful to the moment, logical holes and all. Just like we do with Back to the Future, it's worth excusing so that we can enjoy it, even if it technically makes very little actual sense. The paradox of time travel paradoxes is that, while they make the story convoluted and brain-meltingly hard to wrap your head around, that very quality also makes them fun. Just like the best magic, as long as it doesn't harm the integrity of the rest of the story experience, doesn't make Marty's adventure any less comedic or enjoyable to watch, doesn't take anything from the emotional beats in Harry Potter, it's okay if your time travel is a little zany. Worth it even if it presents moments and opportunities you wouldn't otherwise have found. So, let your character kill their grandfather. Let them be the source of their own inspirations. Let them meet fate by trying to avoid it. Let there be paradoxes if the story wants them, because in the wonderful spaghetti mess that is time travel, who knows what might happen next, if you let it. Speaking of possibilities, this video was just a taste of all the interesting stuff we want to do with video creation. There are so many boundaries we haven't pushed yet that we are just aching to. Unfortunately, experiments can be pretty costly. Unlike regular content, you really have no idea how something experimental is going to perform, and doing something new with content creation almost always forces you to dig a little deeper into your wallet. Nevertheless, we have managed to do some pretty weird stuff over the last few years. Like this video about a fantasy setting that basically has gigantic geographic genitalia, or this video about crafting living beings with magic. But the coolest thing we've ever done, hands down, our 6-part original series, Worldsmiths, which explores some of the most unique fiction by some of the most unique authors. Junji Ito's weirdly pleasant psychological world of horror, Neil Gaiman's darkly honest approach to writing children's stories, and a bunch of others. We put so much effort into that series, and we are just so proud of it. And the reason we got to do all of that? This stuff that would just be a bit too risky to try here on YouTube? Well, we actually have a completely different streaming platform for it, called Nebula. It's amazing. We literally get paid to do experiments over there. All of our videos upload on Nebula a whole week before they upload here on YouTube, without any ads, and, like I said, all the weird stuff that we're just not able to risk making for YouTube goes up there too. In fact, it's the only place you can see a lot of it, and we're not the only ones who have been posting there. The same is true for so many other amazing creators. The entire platform was built by creators for creators. Every time you watch a video over there, a creator you love is getting paid, and far more than they would ever get paid on YouTube. For a lot of us over there, it's become the single best way to fund our more experimental, ambitious content, like our original series, Worldsmiths. And here's the really fun part, you can get Nebula for cheaper than almost any other streaming platform on the internet, like $2.50 per month. That cheap. We want you to have access to our Nebula content, so we've managed to get Foundry fans who sign up using our link a whole 40% off the usual rate. All you have to do is click the link in the description or go to go.nebula.tv/Foundry and sign up for 1 year. That's it. And with our discount on that first year, the whole year is only going to be $30, which again comes out to just $2.50 per month. Frankly, I'm not quite sure how they can afford to do this for us, but I'm definitely not complaining. Seriously, take advantage of this offer while it's still going. I don't think a better one exists in the world of streaming. Anyway, that's all for this one. Thanks for watching, and keep making stuff up. I'll see you next week. Bye!